And again, I would first like to introduce Bruce Campbell and also his colleague, Jason MacLean, both accomplished writers and very intelligent people who have a lot to say about regulatory capture. I'm going to leave it to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Maud. I hope that the G78, the Group of 78 chair, Roy Culpepper, can access this webinar soon. And I'm, welcome everybody that's listening to this or watching us. I want to welcome you to this event on regulatory capture in the fossil fuel sector and its obstruction of efforts to avoid planetary catastrophe. It's drawn from my book, Corporate Rules, The Real World of Business Regulation in Canada, How Government Regulators Are Failing the Public Interest. That's published in 2022 by James Lorimer. The book has 18 contributors, 15 chapters on a variety of sectors, including transportation, health, pharmaceuticals, finance, and of course, relevant to this webinar, several chapters on the fossil fuel sector. And they provide insight into how the industry covers up its role in driving ballooning greenhouse gas emissions and its ongoing efforts to torpedo policies designed to transition away from fossil fuels. So I'm here with one of the authors, the distinguished Jason MacLean, my co-presenter today. And he's one of Canada's leading authorities on regulatory capture. And he was, as far as I know, the first to identify and analyze regulatory capture amongst environmental and fossil fuel regulators in Canada. And his research was essential to my own investigation into the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster. And that conceptually really helped me to understand that relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry. A few weeks ago, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres addressed the 2023 World Economic Forum, accusing big oil of peddling the big lie. He noted that back in the 70s, fossil fuel companies' own research accurately indicated damage to the planet caused by their products. And he said, just like the tobacco industry, they rode roughshod over their own science. Today, fossil fuels producers and their enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that their business model is inconsistent with human survival, he stated. And I would say there's little evidence that a paradigm shift from shareholder value to climate is underway amongst the elite at Davos. Corporations engaged in what Seth Klein calls the new climate denialism, where they claim to accept the climate science, but their actions demonstrate otherwise. Ron Deibert, who's founder of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, which researches cyber espionage, commercial spyware, etc., in his 2020 Massey lecture, described campaigns by the fossil fuel industry to discredit science, pushing out disinformation, and using targeted espionage by private intelligence firms to neutralize civil society. And of course, we know their lobbying power is formidable, including at UN summits. As one critic said in response to the Glasgow's COP, it's akin to Alcoholics Anonymous having a global conference, and the largest delegation is the alcohol industry. So what is regulatory capture, and what are some of its characteristics? I know Jason will go into some of this stuff in more detail, but let me first provide a definition. Regulatory capture involves the power relationship between the regulator and the regulated industry. Regulations are routinely and predictably captured and manipulated to serve the interests of those who are supposed to be subject to them, or bureaucrats and legislators who write or control them. Regulations thus captured serve the interests of these groups instead of the public interest. It goes back, it really gained strength or came into its own as neoliberalism took hold in the 1980s and 90s, spawning deregulation, privatization, austerity, globalization of financial and physical capital, resulting in the reduction of government controls over corporate activity. John Ralston Saul wrote about this changing relationship as a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. Bill Carroll, in his chapter of the book, describes the corporate government relationship in fossil fuels as an ecosystem of obstruction, one consisting of officials and lobbyists interacting with industry associations, a revolving door between senior officials and corporations, and overlapping corporate directorships continuing to obstruct the transition away from fossil fuels. It occurs, he writes, within a wider context of entrenched corporate power, which systemically captures regulation even before specific regulatory agencies are captured. Several authors in the book demonstrate how conflation of public and private interests have become embedded in administrative and regulatory law, potentially subordinating public interest mandate of the regulator to private interests. How the structure of corporate government relationships helps to normalize corruption and allows corporations to avoid serious legal scrutiny and accountability. There's one chapter I want to kind of go through it a little bit because it's written by a former general counsel to the Department of Justice, Edgar Schmidt. And he describes how the Department of Justice practices with respect to regulatory outcomes have diverged from legislative intent. And he writes, in the past, there was an understanding that when Parliament authorized the making of regulations, those tasked with this duties would make regulations they honestly and reasonably believed to be authorized and otherwise lawful. He writes, that understanding has been superseded by an understanding that regulators are free to do virtually anything they wish, anything for which they have risk tolerance. In other words, the DOJ was no longer asking itself in examining regulations whether it believed regulations to be legally valid. Rather, it was asking itself only whether they had the faintest hopes of being legally valid. The latter approach, which is still current according to Schmidt, sees preferences and political interests of ministers as higher priorities than decisions of the legislatures. He continues, doing so downgrades the public interest and instead fosters politically motivated state actions, including the making of regulations that serve industries with political connections or influence. So senior officials who oversee regulatory agencies are generally follow the priorities of their political masters, and those who question actions tend to be ignored and sometimes shifted out of their positions and sometimes removed from office. And the years of austerity under both liberal and conservative governments produced a vicious cycle where gutted regulatory resources in most agencies led to increased pressure to offload responsibilities to companies. So self-regulation or non-regulatory options such as voluntary codes of conduct. I mentioned the revolving door phenomenon, which is central. We're back and forth between regulatory officials from industry and then returned to positions back in industry. And then there's the cabinet directive on regulation, which governs overall regulatory policy. And a central feature of that is the 1-for-1 rule. It was kind of initiated under the Harper government, but it still exists under the current government. And it obliges, the 1-for-1 rule obliges regulatory agencies to offset each proposed regulation, removing one or more existing regulations that constitute a cost to business. And this often ends up with a freeze on new regulations. And I really saw this in doing my research for my Lac-Mégantic book. And you had this massive increase in oil by rail, but no new regulations put in place to protect safety. We can talk about, I don't have time to go into the government's climate record. It is a litany of broken promises. We can discuss that in the Q&A if people want. But I was involved with the Auditor General in railway safety on the Railway Safety Audit Committee. But the Environmental Commissioner, which was reporting just before, and he was looking at transportation of dangerous goods, but he was always also looking at its government's climate record. And he said, we can't continue to go from failure to failure. We need more action and results, not just more targets and plans. So let's say a word about bank finance of fossil fuel production, because financial institutions are key enablers and responsible for the lion's share of money that is pumped into the industry, the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the big 5 banks are among the 20 largest funders of the fossil fuel industry globally, and have invested or loaned almost $1 billion since into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. And there's 20% of their directors also serve on boards of fossil fuel companies. And the public sector is also culpable. Export Development Corporation provides oil and gas companies with considerable financing and loan guarantees and insurance, and the Canadian Quebec pension funds also hold a lot of money in fossil fuel investments. Although the Quebec fund has committed to divesting, supposedly by the end of 2022. I'm not sure if it's reached that yet. I don't know. But I want to say a word about Senator Rosa Galvez, because she's called for ambitious and coherent government intervention in her Climate Aligned Finance Act, which aims to hold governments and financial institutions accountable for their actions. And she outlined her legislation in a keynote speech at the Group of 78 conference in September of 2022. And you can go to that. It's on our website and get a sense of that. You can always also go to her own website to get a sense of that legislation, which is aimed at holding financial institutions accountable. In any case, it's getting a lot of pushback. It's not going through to committee like it should. It really does require advocacy, citizen advocacy, people that are on this call, and you can get a better sense, as I said, going to her website. So just in conclusion, I got hopefully a couple more minutes. So I want to say a few words about overcoming regulatory capture. And I want to refer again to Bill Carroll, who concludes that breaking those close ties between fossil capital and its enablers includes reinventing the regulatory and advisory bodies that have largely enabled what he calls the regime of obstruction, with new mandates and firewalls to prevent regulatory capture. Nathan Lempers, who also contributed a chapter, basically focused on Alberta, suggests an array of reforms to the big oil complicit regulator, the Alberta Energy Regulator. A major move is to implement adequate resources to regulatory bodies, limit the revolving door that I've talked about, and reform legal regimes. Jason will talk more about this, to hold senior officials, politicians, corporate executives, owners to a higher level of legal liability, and changes to the cabinet director of the cabinet directive on regulations, eliminating the one for one rule, prioritizing precautionary principle, and so forth, and increasing parliamentary scrutiny of regulations, that like what Ed Schmid was writing about, has written about in this book, and also to provide support, financial and other forms of support, to public interest groups to enable broader citizen engagement in the legislative and regulatory process. Greater transparency, strengthen the access to information laws, which are very weak, and also greater public access to information was currently protected by commercial confidentiality regulations, and also improve whistleblower protections, which in Canada's are among the worst in the developed world. So I'll leave it at that and hand things over to Jason. Hopefully I've stayed more or less within my time limit. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was great, and thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you as well to the group of 78 for inviting me to participate today, and for all of those of you who have, during the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, tuned in to talk about this timely and important topic. I'm going to mostly talk about one really critical aspect of regulatory capture with respect to climate and energy policy in Canada, what I call the cultural capture of the imagination of what's even possible when it comes to climate and energy law and policy. But before I get there, I guess I'll just talk very briefly about the origins of my own involvement in doing this kind of work, and then I'll tie that into what I think is important in terms of how we move forward to escape regulatory capture, which becomes the key thing that we have to focus on once we've established that it's occurring, that it's pervasive, and that its impacts are really dysfunctional. As an early an environmental law scholar, after being a lawyer for a number of years, I was participating in an environmental law conference in 2015 that was structured around the theme of lamenting how the Harper government had gutted federal environmental laws in 2012 through two omnibus bills. And what occurred to me as a relatively new scholar of Canadian environmental law was that the overwhelming focus of my more senior colleagues was on the symptoms of an underlying dysfunction. In other words, the symptoms of a gutted Environmental Assessment Act, the symptoms of environmental regulations that have been stripped of their potential power on paper, notwithstanding the already long record of insufficient capacity and enforcement on the ground before that. And it occurred to me that we weren't really focusing on the root causes of not only those particular omnibus bills, but of the weaknesses of Canadian environmental law more generally, and really for the most part of its short career since the 1970s. And for whatever reason, I suppose it was fortunate that long before I became a lawyer and when I was in graduate school studying for a PhD, my best friend was studying for a PhD in economics, and he introduced me to the work of George Stigler, who in part won a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on regulatory capture. The ironic thing about much economic research in the Stigler mode was that they had identified, largely in the American context, that a number of agencies set up to regulate powerful industries, beginning with railroads in the late 1800s in the United States, soon ended up becoming captured by the industries that they were meant to regulate for a number of reasons, because of the asymmetry in economic power between the regulated and the regulators, between the asymmetries in knowledge and expertise and resources, but also significantly as well because of the frequent, both formal, think of lobbying, but also frequent informal contact between regulators and the regulated. They tend to come from the same socioeconomic origins, receive the same types of education, see the world very much in the same way. And for economists, early neoliberalists, the University of Chicago School, they saw regulatory capture as a pathology, but their instinct was to get rid of regulation altogether. For them, there was no way of reforming it. But for me, a graduate student in anthropology and sociology who believed in the importance of public institutions serving the public interest, it inspired me, and I soon found the work of other social scientists outside of economics who would look at regulatory capture and then think about, how do we escape capture? How do we prevent capture? How do we reform public institutions so as to shift their mandate away from the private interests they're supposed to be regulating back to the public interest? And so that's how I first got into this. And for me, looking at climate change policy and energy policy, and you can't understand one without the other in Canada. In 2013, 2014, 2015, it was all about trying to document and convince my colleagues, really, that until we address the root cause of our poor climate laws and energy laws and environmental assessment laws, i.e., that they were in some cases literally being drafted by the oil and gas industry and its lobbyists, sometimes in their boardrooms. But even when they weren't literally being drafted by them, they were being framed so as to promote their interests, and as Bruce pointed out, and then ideologically conflate their interests with the broader public interest. Until we address that and document that, then we won't be able to escape it. We won't, and then even think about how to prevent it moving forward. And so my research then began to shift to some of the, I would call them, more insidious ways that capture infiltrates the public and also political imagination in terms of the acceptable terms of debate and the limits of debate in terms of what's possible. And that led me to begin to really carefully scrutinize Canadian media, in particular corporate-controlled media, including prominently Canada's newspaper of record. Now, that's a contentious claim in certain parts of the West, and I know there's some folks from the West who are tuning in, but Canada's newspaper of record, at least self-proclaimed, is that of the Globe and Mail. And I published a peer-reviewed article looking at the Globe and Mail's editorial board and its promotion of various oil pipeline projects in Canada, and concluded that because of some of the work that Bruce has already told you about in terms of the corporate mapping project and the overlapping and shared financial interests of the ownership of corporate media, including the Globe and Mail and the interconnections with banks and oil and gas industries, it's not a surprise that the Globe and Mail promotes the interests of the oil and gas industry and all but ignores the policy implications of independent academic climate science. Indeed, if folks who are tuning in are regular readers of the Globe and Mail, then they should need very little convincing that the Globe and Mail, with respect to energy and climate, is almost a science-free zone. And I'm going to provide two recent and I think really quite egregious examples of that. I'm going to read to you for just a little bit, and then I'm going to contrast those with the contrary findings of independent climate science, and then talk a little bit about how we move forward, including addressing the first question that I saw in the chat. And so the first example that I'll give you is, it was published just recently, an editorial in the Globe and Mail, the title, "How the Oil Sands Compete in a World of Lower Demand and Far Lower Emissions." And the editorial board of the Globe and Mail begins almost in a cheer by saying, "Oil production in Alberta has never been higher. Output almost reached 4 million barrels a day last November, led by the oil sands." And then the Globe and Mail suggests that the challenge for the oil sands is to reduce its voluminous greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for a world in which demand is lower. You'll notice that the editorial board of the Globe and Mail does not contemplate, it's not part of the acceptable terms of political debate in mainstream media in Canada that we would phase out the fossil fuel industry. You can't say that in the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail won't publish it. The Globe and Mail notes that the Liberals last year promised that there would be no forced production cuts that are, quote, not driven by declines in global demand. And it relies for its forecasts on global demand, not on independent climate science, not even on the conservative International Energy Agency, but rather on British Petroleum, a company that just recorded, due to the war in Ukraine, record profits and also slashed its own climate goals and announced anticipated production increases for the next 7 years. That, for the Globe and Mail, is what an authoritative source of climate and energy projections are. Again, no mention of a global and an increasingly shrinking global climate carbon budget, no mention of 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways, and the scientific imperative to phase out fossil fuel production, including in Canada. Exhibit 2 in my recent analysis or ongoing analysis of the cultural capture of the policy imagination in Canada is an op-ed that the Globe and Mail published just in the last couple of days by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a think tank that's very closely aligned with the oil and gas industry. The title of this op-ed, which is utterly counterfactual, is "For the Oil Patch, Just Transition is a Buzzword, Not Sound Economics." And there are some really astonishing lines that I have to share. It begins by saying, "It's hard to imagine a sector in less need of transition support. Canadian production has never been higher and the industry is booming." I'll just remind you that it's February of 2023 when these words were published by Canada's newspaper of record. And then the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, in an utter fabrication, suggests that the just transition buzzword, its origins were in the 2014-2015 slowdown in the oil sands. But because the oil sands are now booming again, there's now no need for a just transition. And listen to what the Macdonald-Laurier Institute says, published in the Globe and Mail, and I quote, "The anticipated peak for oil demand is perpetually a decade away," meaning it's never going to peak, and the future is going to be one that is full of oil and gas. Remarkable counterfactual, counter history, is the federal government is planning just transition legislation, likely to be called something like the Sustainable Jobs Act or the Green Jobs Act. And indications are that it'll release this legislation in the early summer following Alberta's provincial election in May, so as not to antagonize Albertans with the politicized rhetoric of a just transition. Now, let me compare that forecast based on oil and gas producers and their lobbyists on the one hand in the Globe and Mail, and here's what independent peer-reviewed climate modeling suggests for Canadian energy and climate policy. This is independent, published in the world's leading scientific journals. First, independent peer-reviewed climate science tells us to have even just a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We're at anywhere between 1.2 and 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial norm right now. Rich producer countries, and that explicitly includes Canada, have to cut oil and gas production by 74% by the year 2030 and completely phase out production by 2034. And for those in the media in particular, and I had one media editor ask me in respect of a piece that I wrote where I rehearsed this bit of peer-reviewed climate science, do you mean by phase out zero, no production? Because in Canada, that's kind of unthinkable. Phase out or zero would mean, well, still lots of oil and gas, right? Similar modeling published in the journal Nature shows that 83% of Canada's oil reserves must remain in the ground just to have 50-50 odds of staying within a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. You will never see these figures or these studies cited in the Globe and Mail. And I'll just add, rarely do I see discussion of peer-reviewed climate science and the implications for policy published in Canada's independent media either. The independent media, I also believe, has to significantly raise its game. Now, let me just give you one bit of contrast, and then I'll reemerge from current events time and talk about the implications of how we could potentially get out of this mess. In another Globe editorial that caught my attention last week, announcing the growing threat of a low-wage future for Canada, the Globe discussed a relatively recent report by the OECD published in 2021, showing that in its forecasts, by the year 2060, Canada would have the lowest per capita GDP in the OECD because of structural problems and an enduring lack of innovation in the Canadian economy. Here's what the editorial board of the Globe and Mail tells Canadians and the Canadian government that it needs to do. And I quote, fundamentally, that would require, and this innovation requires, patience for structural reforms to take hold, the belief that the private sector can innovate without government handholding, and the courage to argue aggressive measures are needed to head off decades-long decline in a low-wage economy. Of course, the exception is that the oil and gas industry is entitled to billions of dollars in federal subsidies for the magical false solution of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. But for all other industries other than oil and gas, they have to get off the government teat and learn how to compete in a brave new world, but not oil and gas. That's all about government-industry partnership. All right. So in terms of what we do about this, and Bruce canvassed a number of really thoughtful and important potential policy and regulatory reforms. And I would argue that all of those make a lot of sense and are important, and we should think about them. But once again, we have to also make sure that we're paying attention to the root causes. And without addressing the root causes, all of those types of reforms will get caught in what I call the catch-22 of regulatory reform. In other words, they require a level of regulatory freedom that they don't have. And if they did, we wouldn't need them in the first place. In other words, captured regulators and captured legislators can't free themselves. So what is the answer? And this is where regulatory capture research and the implications of it take a bit of a, well, I don't want to say grim turn, but a difficult turn. And that is, without a broad-based and sustained democratic citizen-based movement demanding that public institutions and regulations serve the public and be based on science and not industry profit projections, we're never going to escape this cycle that we're in. Last week, I was, along with probably several of you, absolutely rapt by the parliamentary committee hearing grilling Dominic Barton, our former ambassador to China, and before that, the managing partner of the global consultancy McKinsey and Company, and the role that McKinsey and Company is increasingly and quite stealthily, along with a number of other consultants, playing in our civil servants, while meantime trading on that information that it's learning about the regulatory process and selling that to its corporate clients. It's exhibit A of how you facilitate regulatory capture. You play both sides of the fence, and that's exactly what McKinsey did in the United States, turbocharging the marketing and demand for addictive opioids in the United States. And you know, interestingly, I was wrapped by that. I wove it into a presentation I gave at a different university last week. And then when I got back to my day job this week teaching law students, I asked my law students how many of them had paid attention. None had paid attention. In fact, less than half of the class even knew who McKinsey was. So in other words, we can talk about, and we need to talk about, don't get me wrong, the various types of reforms that we have to initiate. But I would respectfully dissent from the idea that we, the global we, the collective we, all know that regulatory capture is occurring. It's not quite that simple. Those of us in a relatively small bubble are aware that it's occurring. The average Canadian has no idea that it's occurring, has never heard the phrase before, doesn't know the mechanisms, isn't aware that this is how our law is drafted, how our regulations are drafted, and how they're not enforced in the public interest. And a big part of that, and one of the reasons I've focused so much on the media, is to show how impoverished our media landscape is. And in many ways, again, without just resorting to finger pointing, and I'm going to wrap up in 30 seconds so we can go into Q&A. In many ways, it's true that we get the media that we deserve. And so one of the very concrete things that we can all begin doing right away is begin demanding a better, more democratic, more critical, more grown-up media landscape to be able to begin to build the broader awareness that's going to be required to build a broader democratic counter-movement to escape regulatory capture, because otherwise the perverse unintended result of decades of research into regulatory capture, whether by right-wing neoliberals who want to just get rid of regulation, which is very much an agenda in the United States, or among those who might identify as left or progressive or whatever, to reform regulation, the message that's getting through, and I've learned this from my own, really smart students, is that the victim is being blamed. So regulatory agencies that end up getting captured then appear to be incompetent and appear to be dysfunctional, ends up reducing public trust in public institutions. And in a remarkable turn, more trust is reposed in the very corporations that set out to capture and defang our regulatory agencies in the first place. Regulatory capture has a public messaging problem. And so we desperately need to change that message and the implications in order to address this problem. And with that, I'll leave it there and just say thanks again. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, both you, Jason, and Bruce. Seeing as we have an issue still with our with Roy being able to join us, Roy has asked me to step in and to take care of our Q&A. So thank you again for your presentation. And so one of the questions that was written was, so Glenn Wright had written, I think most accept that regulatory capture exists and is likely getting more pronounced. What will it take to curb and address it? Tackling each specific regulatory administrator piecemeal, as in one slice at a time, or is the broader focus on strengthening democracy via electoral reform, and first past the post elections for transparency and lobbying, stricter political finance rules, and bringing back per vote subsidies to assist less established political parties? One seems to think that the big players have political puppets in each of the parties, such that elections don't really address regulatory capture. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think the implication there is what Jason ended with, which is that to overcome or to escape regulatory capture, it requires widespread political mobilization, and it also requires a sea change in political leadership, and that's a big hurdle. And Jason focused on the mainstream media and how it just reinforces capture and leaves people kind of in the dark. I'm just wondering, I actually have a question for Jason, which was, and that is with respect to media organizations like the Narwhal or the National Observer or the Guardian. To what extent are they, can we look to those organizations to help get us kind of over, beyond this kind of morass of disinformation or non-information or cover up that the media engages in and doesn't allow or makes it difficult to get to citizens more broadly?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Glenn, for your question. I'd read it before I started making my remarks, so I tried to weave in, as Bruce pointed out, part of the answer. I mean, also part of what I would say is yes to all of the above. Whatever people feel energized about tackling, they should. And if we have time, I want to talk a little bit about the role strategic litigation can play in this area, and I can give a couple of early examples as well. But to the point about the media landscape, I think that arguably the scarcest and most valuable resource in the world is attention, public attention. It's so difficult to marshal and to sustain and to transform it into movements. Our media and culture landscape are really stacked against that. As for your question, Bruce, I mean, I think The Guardian does a good job for an independent newspaper. It certainly does a better job than any news media source in Canada of reporting on ongoing climate science and drawing out its implications for policy. I would love to see it run more articles expressly about regulatory capture and political capture and other forms of perfectly legal but utterly harmful political corruption and corruption of the democratic process. I mean, going back just for a minute to Glenn's question, which sort of had maybe a bit of an answer built in as well. Strengthening our democracy, but making it not just about, not reducing democracy to electoral politics, I think is absolutely a part of the answer. Easier said than done, but animating an idea of democratic citizenry as a kind of an ongoing active participation in these issues, not just during election times, is really critical. I will say, I wasn't initially going to do this, but I think, fair game. I think the independent media in Canada are way too timid in calling these out as well. They refuse to call out the role of the mainstream corporate media. And Canada's corporate media, and I've studied this, is among the most highly concentrated in terms of corporate ownership, which means the range of acceptable political and policy viewpoints is really quite narrow. So it's really frustrating to read the coverage of, and it really doesn't matter if you're reading the Globe and Mail, the National Post, or the Toronto Star, or any of the Sun papers. Their view on climate policy and energy policy is virtually indistinguishable. And there's science-free zones. Even the New York Times does a much better job than media in Canada. And that's something I like to emphasize the media a bit, because that's something where, people can play an active role. They can begin threatening to cancel their subscriptions. To cancel your subscription to the Globe and Mail, you can't do it online. They've got you trapped. You've got to call them. You've got to convince them over the phone to do it, right? You call them up and say, I think your coverage is abominable. And if more people started doing that, it'd start to have an effect. That's how these things work. But I would also say, it really is a matter of people piling in and pursuing all of these worthwhile strategies, because I don't think there's no silver bullet to this, in other words. And so it's wherever people feel most energized, I think they should get involved.
Thank you so much. I have a question here from Roy for Bruce. And he asks, what kind of pushback is Senator Galvez getting on S-243? Do you have any suggestions for CSOs to help push it forward? And should we write to Gibault or others?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. In fact, I just contacted Senator Galvez. I wanted to get a sense of where her legislation was at. Doesn't seem to have gone beyond second reading. When it goes to committee, that's the chance for people to engage in discussion and debate and support for her legislation. Well, there'll be people that will be opposed, and the people that are I think there's opposition within the government, within the ministry, the relevant ministries of government, within the environment minister, whatever. I think there's resistance to that, and basically what they've done is procrastinate and delay and say, you'll hear our response to her legislation in due course. Well, this has been almost a year since she introduced this legislation. There's been reporting in the media about her Climate Aligned Finance Act. There needs to be more. I think what citizens can do is well, first of all, go to get a better sense of the legislation, either going to the G78 website where she did. She was one of the keynote speakers. You can get a better sense there, but you can go to her site as well. And I think I think citizens can go to their local MP, their local MPP, their local municipal politicians to push for her legislation to work its way through the system, and maybe a counterpart can be introduced in the House of Commons. But we know, that, and we've already discussed it, that banks and financial institutions and asset hedge funds, et cetera, are major enablers of legislation that that advances fossil fuel production and resisting to the kind of things that Jason is talking about. So yeah, I think that's one kind of flicker of optimistic, and there are others within the government as well, or within the parliament as well, and those should be pushed and encouraged to address the issue of the government's record, but also the power relationship between the government and the regulatory agencies and regulated industries in general, but fossil fuels in particular.
Can I just briefly add to that? Bill McKibben, environmental activist in the United States, certainly is devoting most of his attention these days to taking on banks and the financial enablers of the fossil fuels industry. And the researchers have been doing some really eye-opening work, including the way in which banks use and leverage depositors' accounts for fossil fuel investments. One thing, there's a focus in the climate activism literature of thinking about what can individuals do to try and scale up their actions, and looking at actions that can be scalable. One-time action that's immediately scalable is take your money out of big banks and move them into credit unions, because the money that you're depositing into your savings and checkings account, if you're banking with the big six banks in Canada, you are actually, without knowing it, financing fossil fuel extraction. So take your money out and tell the banks why you're taking your money out. It's a one-time thing that can have it's a one-time individual action that addresses itself to structural reform, just as one example.
That's great. We have another comment and question from Fiona McMurray. I think there's a significant lack of awareness of regulatory capture among those concerned about climate change, let alone the public at large, and I quite agree that media of all kinds is keeping us ignorant and politically naive. I wonder what you think of the response of alternative media to the work of Stephen Gigot in his role as Federal Environment and Climate Change Minister. I think you mean Climate Change Minister, for instance. Thank you.
I'll let you take that on.
I was about to say, go ahead, Bruce. It's a good question. Great question. Fair question. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll put my step in it here, but I think he's been given a pass. This is my own personal view. I think he's been given a pass. I've been hugely disappointed by his rhetoric and his positioning since he's taken the position. I was really disappointed with his discourse coming out of COP27 about loss and damage, and saying he would never expose Canadians to liability. Why not? In terms of cumulative greenhouse gas emitters, we're 10th in the world. We have a responsibility for loss and damage that's occurring around the world, including in the global south. We absolutely are liable. He's been adding, I believe, the imprimatur of a really impressive record of environmental and climate activism, no doubt about it, but he's lending that record and credibility and giving incrementalism and business as usual political cover that I think we can't afford. We can't afford to subsidize the fossil fuel industry with, the magical solutions of carbon capture, including blue hydrogen. These are false solutions that entail a significant moral hazard that disincentivize making emission cuts and changes to our economy now, and instead gambling on techno fixes that will allow business as usual. It's a dangerous delusion, and I had personally hoped he would do more, but I don't see a lot of distance between his messaging and that of Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, who recently just said in a fireside chat with the head of the United Nations that Canada can fight climate change without phasing out the fossil fuel industry. And there's just simply no support for that in independent climate science.
Yeah.
None, zero. So
neither of them will talk about phasing out or even phasing down, and they kept the language out of the climate summit. On the other hand, I mean, it's this is as you said, an activist with a good reputation who has leapt into the political fray, and is that the consequence? And acting otherwise, would he have lasted? And is he doing incrementally? I mean, those are questions he's been given credit for. I mean, I've read he's been given credit for being one of the advocates of loss and damage, of the loss and damage fund that came out of COP27. He's been given credit for COP15 and a kind of a Paris-like pact on nature. So so it is. I don't know if we've answered the question, but thanks for it.
All right. Well, seeing it. Oh, of course, there's a further question. Oh, another comment from Glenn. Even the CBC, who promised to change reporting on climate back in 2021 with the promotion of Our Changing Planet, they've also really failed in covering the science. The Narwhal and National Observer have such limited resources. I don't know how to get more coverage when independents have limited resources. We are all collectively captured. Somehow you are correct. We need to inspire and take back the cultural imagination of how our lives can be better by accelerating the transition.
Yeah. Listen, I think what's evident from this discussion is, the challenge of overcoming escaping capture is daunting. But we don't. Giving up the fight isn't an option, and we have to keep fighting. And it's, I think you said, and Jason, that it's corrosive of our democracy, and it's also created the unprecedented wealth inequality pyramid that we are faced with, and created an existential threat to the planet. But the fight, giving up the fight is not an option.
I agree, and I just wanted to mention, because Bruce, you told me about and correct me if I'm wrong, but you told me about the origins of the group of 78, mm-hmm. of which I was unaware, and I've been reflecting on that for the last couple of days, and I take some inspiration in that, where you had literally a group of 78 Canadians back in the early 1980s reach out to the first Prime Minister Trudeau, wrote a letter and said, we need you need to get more engaged in, peace and security issues around the world, and Canada has to step up. And, to me, that in and of itself is an inspiring thing. I think, I talk to law students about this all the time who want to get more involved but feel overwhelmed and don't know how to do it. Not just law students, law professors. When I give a presentation at a law school, law professors will say, oh God, I can't stand it when these environmental law profs come in. It's so depressing, it's so grim. And I'm really trying to counteract that. And Bruce is absolutely right. What we know about counteracting this is acting in some sort of way, starting to act, and to not just lament it, not just criticize it. So, one of the earlier comments, I think it was Fiona that made, I absolutely agree. When we use we have to use the pronoun we very advisedly. Most Canadians, most educated Canadians, many journalists that I talk to routinely as part of my work aren't familiar with regulatory capture. We need to spread the word about this, and talk about why it's pathological and corrosive, and begin talking about and raising the issue of doing something about it. And I think writing a letter to your MP, writing a letter to the Prime Minister. I've been doing that with academic colleagues. We wrote a letter. It turned out to not be successful, urging the government to not provide an investment tax credit for carbon capture. But we're just going to keep going. We're going to write another letter urging the government to not pour good money after bad with respect to blue hydrogen. By the time it ever materialized, there won't be any demand for it. We're pumping investments for natural gas production. Our major customer, the United States, is poised to become the world's largest producer within the next decade. How does that make sense for a competitive energy policy? So I think the easy way out of despair, or out of gloom, or even out of paralysis, find a way to start acting. And I'd like to just add on a hopeful note, I'm starting to see, though, some uptick among lawyers and other law scholars about regulatory capture as a useful lens. And I'm trying to help in some of these initiatives, trying to take regulatory capture and not just use it as a form of academic analysis, but also to make it legally actionable. So to begin to embed it in strategic litigation against not only private sector polluters, but also the government agencies that they've captured. Any government agency that is effectively captured isn't interpreting or administering its statute, its legislation properly. So there's grounds for legal redress there. So there are cases that can be made using explicitly regulatory capture to begin to get wins in the legal system that can be then leveraged as part of a broader public policy discussion in order to change the normativity and hopefully to break back against some of the corrosive cynicism that goes along with when sometimes I talk to people about regulatory capture and they'll say, oh yeah, well, of course, right? Which is, okay, have that reaction, but then follow it up with, all right, so what are we going to do to try to redress it? That's the critical thing. And I'm hopeful that we could see some really interesting strategic litigation over the next few years that's going to bring regulatory capture to a broader public audience. I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, I just if people on this webinar are thinking, well, you're hopeful, but are you being naive, or you're too ambitious, or really we have to kind of come down to earth a bit. I was listening to the words, or I read the piece by I don't know if people are familiar with Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis is a member of the European Parliament. He's also a professor of economics at Athens University. He was also the Greek finance minister that went up against the IMF and the European community when they and then just resign. Anyways, and I have some personal contact with Yanis as well, because when I was director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we brought him to Parliament to be critical of the or to make comments on Harper government austerity in the wake of the 2008-2009 crash. So anyways, he was speaking just a couple of weeks ago at the Havana Congress for a new international economic order regarding the creation of a new non-aligned nations movement. That's where he was going. And he states that a transition to a global sustainable economic order will require a large green investment fund. And he's talking about $10 trillion annually. And he says, in his view, this can be done through a repurposed World Bank backed by a digital currency issued by a repurposed international monetary fund in which all capital and trade flows are denominated. To accomplish what he calls global green Keynesianism, there needs to be a toppling of what he calls the global empire of capital. How can this be done? By legislating so that corporations belong to those who work in them. In other words, one employee, one share, one vote, and by denying banks the monopoly over people's transactions. And he ends with, this twin democratization of capital and of money sounds like an impossible dream, but not more impossible than the ideas of one person, one vote, or of ending the divine right of kings once sounded. It's nothing short of a precondition for our species' survival. Now, that's ambitious.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Jason and Bruce. We finally managed to get Roy in on the call, so he's going to take over and do our official thank yous. Again, so much thanks for all your work today and for the work that you continue to do. I'm going to pass this over to Roy Culpepper.
Thanks, Maud. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry I couldn't join. Technical glitches will have to be smoothed out somehow after this call. I just actually had a question, if I may throw it into the end of the queue before we close. We've got another 5-10 minutes. As Bruce knows, for the past couple of years, the Group of 78 has been focusing on adaptation issues. And without taking a single thing away from what we've been talking about for the past hour and a half, is there a way you can apply your critical analysis, your critical model of regulatory capture to the field of adaptation to climate change? And I say that because adaptation is something at which the whole world is failing. We're failing to face and confront and protect ourselves against the climate devastation that is surely going to come year after year all over the world, including all parts of Canada. Is there evidence of regulatory capture? And I'm thinking here of an article by Bruce Saltmate in the Globe's report on business today, where he talks about the liabilities and damage caused particularly by flooding across Canada. And then goes on to say what we need is a much more comprehensive nationwide flood mapping system that's ready to roll out like in the next couple of years, if possible, because the national adaptation strategy that the government came up with at the end of November looks at much more distant targets, 2050 and so forth, and we'll all be washed away by then in the flood. So, question, is there similar or even different kinds of ways in which regulations are being either bent or just failing to address the demands and the challenges of adaptation that we must surely have to face going forward.
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I just thinking about the comments from Yanis Varoufakis when he was talking about a global green Keynesianism and the amount of money, because where this, as you well know, Roy, and I'm sure people on the call know, that the people that are suffering the effects the most are the people that are least caused it, and Varoufakis is advocating a huge amount, but to get there, major structural changes in the relationship, in the empire of capital, as he refers to, are required, and so, but talk about incrementalism, the loss and damages fund without any resources attached to it, whether a loss and damage domestically or internationally, because it's happening in both levels, and it's those that are least able to deal with it that are getting hit the hardest, whether it's in flood zones or whatever. It's the low income, it's the racialized communities that are feeling the most effects, but I think I'm going to ask you, suggest that you carry this on, Jason, in terms of linking it to capture. I mean, the incrementalism is definitely a manifestation of capture, and the kind of the reluctance to really kind of go full force into it or make any structural change in the relationship between that relationship is a major impediment for sure to adaptation, or to compensation and adaptation.
Well, just so to make sure that we don't end on a hopeful note, I would just say that, when it comes to climate adaptation, it's an over-determined problem. And what I mean by that is there are multiple sources that are militating against us, putting in the kinds of capital and preventive infrastructural change. I mean, think about the crisis in public health provision in Canada. I'm old enough to remember the Romano report in the 1990s, which very convincingly argued that the key to a successful and affordable healthcare, public healthcare system in Canada was the shift away from reaction to prevention. And we haven't done it. And look at where we are now. Our system is literally crumbling because we haven't done that. And so when you want to talk about a super wickedly complex problem, adaptation is it, because adaptation requires the long-term policy planning, long-term allocation of capital when we are wired politically and even neurologically towards short-term action. So I think capture plays a role, at the intermediary levels and institutional levels, the lack of industry changes when it comes to insurance, the static movement around building codes, the inertia around municipal planning, and the roles that it requires a coordinated response, but we have government by silos. It requires medium to long-term planning and capital commitment, but our financial system is all about short-term capital liquidity and trading, and that's why sustainable finance hasn't gone anywhere yet and won't until there's more government coordination and also government planning that goes beyond the next election cycle, which we don't have. So it's hard to imagine a problem that's more difficult than having science-based climate adaptation, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, thank you to you both for that very comprehensive response to a complex question. And the struggle, I'm sure, is going to continue as we go forward, both on the adaptation side and on mitigation. And thank you, Bruce, for bringing up the plight of the poorest countries. We only have to think of Pakistan recently, where 33 million people were affected by the huge and unprecedented flooding that took place in that country. And just a year or so before that, 4 or 5 typhoons hitting Southeast Africa, from Mozambique to Madagascar. Incredible climate devastation. Anyway, that brings me to the closing of our webinar today. Bruce and Jason, thank you both for your articulation of the problem and for daring to think of the solutions and alternatives which we must embrace. And thank you for bringing up Bruce Varoufakis's visionary proposal for a new international economic order, which has been articulated before, but needs to be pushed much more forcefully again. So thank you to participants for joining our webinar today. This will be recorded and available. Thank you for your questions. I just wanted to say that our next webinar is going to take place on February the 23rd, the review of the general preferential tariff and Canada's international, feminist international policy. How do these, or do these jibe? Our guest speaker will be Fawzia Moore, a trade expert, and our moderator will be Anne Weston from IDRC. That being said, if you have any comments or feedback, please do write to the Group 78 or to myself. We'd be thrilled to hear what you have to say and any suggestions you may have for this or current or future webinars. There's a couple more coming up in March I can mention briefly. One on the future of democracy in Latin America, featuring Max Cameron from UBC, and one on global security at the end, food security at the end of March, featuring Evan Fraser from the University of Guelph. So we have a full program of webinars. Please remember to support the Group of 78. If you're not a member, please join. If you are a member and your membership's lapsed, please rejoin. And in either case, please think of donations to the Group of 78 when you are in a donation giving mode. And finally, thank you for Mode for organizing this webinar. It didn't go completely according to plan, but anyway, a lot of ground was traversed and a lot of thoughts were exchanged, and they were all good ones. And once again, thanks to all. So take care and see you at our next webinar.
Take care, Jason.
Take care, Bruce, and thanks again. This was wonderful, and thanks for everybody who attended.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah.